Early 1943, the North Atlantic. From the bridges of German U-boats, the war at sea appears to be nearing victory. Allied merchant ships continue to vanish beneath the waves, their burning wrecks stretching from the American coast to the British Isles. To the men of the Kriegsmarine, the ocean still belongs to them. For more than 3 years, German submarines have hunted almost without restraint. Convoys are detected, shadowed for hours, sometimes days, and then overwhelmed by coordinated night attacks. One U-boat makes contact, radios the position, and others converge from every direction. It is a system refined through experience, discipline, and blood. The wolf pack doctrine. The numbers reinforce the belief. In 1942 alone, more than 7 million tons of Allied shipping are sunk. Tankers, freighters, troop transports, destroyed faster than they can be replaced. Even after the United States enters the war, many German commanders believe American industry will take years to change the balance. Years the Allies may not have. Among U-boat crews, confidence runs high. Veteran commanders wear their tonnage tallies with pride. Patrol reports circulate like legends. New captains study past successes and expect the same results. The Atlantic still feels vast, dark, and forgiving, a place where a submarine can strike and disappear into the depths. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Donitz sees confirmation of everything he has built. Reports show shipping losses continuing at a pace that threatens Britain's survival. If pressure is maintained just a little longer, Allied supply lines will collapse. Without food, fuel, and raw materials, Britain cannot fight. And without Britain, there can be no return to Europe. To the men aboard the U-boats, the enemy still looks vulnerable. Convoys remain scattered. Escorts are stretched thin. Aircraft coverage is incomplete. The ocean itself still seems to favor the hunter. What they do not yet realize is that the hunt is already changing. Quietly, methodically, far from the drama of torpedoes and burning ships, the Allies are rebuilding the entire system of convoy defense, not to survive the wolves, but to destroy them. In early 1943, the U-boat war still looks like a German triumph. But beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the balance is shifting. And the same ocean that once concealed the hunters is about to become their grave. The success of the U-boat war is not an accident. It is the result of a system carefully designed before the war even began. German naval planners understood one simple truth: a single submarine attacking alone was inefficient. Its strength lay not in firepower, but in coordination. From this idea came the doctrine that defined the Battle of the Atlantic: the wolf pack. The process was methodical. U-boats patrolled vast ocean areas spread hundreds of miles apart. When one submarine sighted a convoy, it did not attack immediately. Instead, it shadowed the target from a distance, reporting course, speed, and composition by radio. Other submarines were then directed toward the convoy, sometimes from days away. Once enough boats were in position, the attack began, usually at night. Surface submarines, harder to detect in darkness, slipped through the convoy's defenses. Torpedoes were fired at close range. Confusion followed. Escorts struggled to identify targets. Merchant ships burned. And before dawn, the U-boats vanished again into the Atlantic. This tactic worked because the enemy defenses were limited. Early in the war, Allied escorts lacked reliable radar. Sonar lost contact during attacks. Aircraft coverage was patchy or non-existent across large stretches of ocean. Convoys often sailed blind, unaware they were being tracked until torpedoes exploded among them. To German commanders, the Atlantic was a mathematical problem, and one they believed they had solved. More submarines meant more contacts. More contacts meant more kills. Losses were expected, even accepted, as long as sinkings exceeded construction. For a time, the numbers supported this belief. Submarine losses were painful but manageable. Replacement crews could be trained. New boats rolled out of shipyards. Each patrol promised the possibility of another devastating night attack. The Wolfpack doctrine assumed that the ocean itself would always provide concealment. Darkness, distance, and weather were allies. The submarine did not need to defeat the convoy escorts, only to survive long enough to strike again. What the doctrine did not account for was a future where the ocean would no longer hide anything, because the mathematics of the Atlantic were about to change. For much of the war, Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic almost blind. Merchant ships sailed in tight formations, protected by a handful of escorts armed with depth charges and little else. These destroyers and corvettes were brave, often skilled, but critically limited by technology. Their sonar systems could detect submarines underwater, but only in narrow cones and only at short range. The moment an escort passed over a target to attack, sonar contact was lost. Radar, where it existed at all, was crude and unreliable. Early sets struggled to detect low-profile targets like surface submarines, especially at night or in heavy seas. Many escorts sailed without radar entirely. Others had equipment that broke down as often as it worked. Worst of all was the air gap. For thousands of miles in the central Atlantic, convoys had no air cover at all. Land-based aircraft simply did not have the range to reach them. Once a convoy passed beyond the reach of coastal patrols, it was alone. U-boats understood this perfectly. These unprotected zones became killing grounds where wolf packs could gather, shadow targets, and attack without fear of aircraft interference. Escorts faced impossible choices. Chase a contact too aggressively, and they risked leaving the convoy exposed to other submarines. Stay too close, and U-boats slipped through the defensive screen. Depth charge attacks were loud, imprecise, and exhausting. Many attacks damaged nothing but the ocean itself. Night favored the attacker. U-boats surfaced after dark, becoming faster and more maneuverable than the ships hunting them. From the bridge of a surface submarine, a convoy appeared as a line of black silhouettes against the horizon. Torpedoes could be fired from close range with devastating accuracy. Merchant sailors felt the imbalance keenly. Ships exploded without warning. Fires raged unchecked. Crews abandoned ship into freezing water, while escorts fought invisible enemies beneath the waves. Survival depended more on luck than protection. Allied commanders knew they were losing ships faster than they could fully protect them, but for years there was no clear solution. More escorts helped, but not enough. Better training improved survival, but did not stop the sinkings. The Atlantic remained too large, too dark, and too unforgiving. To the U-boat commanders, this confirmed what they already believed. The convoy system was fundamentally flawed, but this blindness would not last forever. And when the Allies finally learned how to see, the hunters would become the hunted. While U-boats continued to hunt in the Atlantic, the real battle was shifting far from the ocean itself. In offices, laboratories, workshops, and training schools across Britain, Canada, and the United States, the Allies were rebuilding the entire system of anti-submarine warfare. Not with dramatic weapons or single breakthroughs, but through a quiet revolution of technology, coordination, and information. One of the most important changes was invisible to the crews at sea: signals intelligence. German U-boats relied on radio to coordinate wolfpack attacks. Every contact report, every shadowing message, every call for reinforcements traveled through the air as radio waves. Allied listening stations began intercepting these transmissions, using high-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known to sailors as Huff Duff. With multiple stations taking bearings, Allied commanders could pinpoint the approximate location of transmitting submarine within minutes. Even more dangerous for the U-boats was what happened to their encryption. For years, the German Enigma machine had protected submarine communications. But by 1943, Allied codebreakers were increasingly able to read U-boat traffic, sometimes in near real time. Convoys were rerouted, patrol lines were avoided, and hunting groups were sent directly toward known submarine concentrations. At sea, detection technology improved just as rapidly. New centimetric radar sets could detect the small outline of a surface submarine at night or in poor weather. What had once been invisible now appeared clearly on radar screens. Darkness no longer provided safety. Sonar improved as well. Operators were better trained. Equipment became more reliable. Contact could be held longer, tracked more accurately, and shared between ships. The ocean was slowly losing its ability to hide submarines. Air power completed the transformation. Long-range patrol aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, bringing constant surveillance to areas once dominated by U-boats. Radar-equipped aircraft hunted at night. Powerful searchlights like the Lee light illuminated submarines caught on the surface, turning surprise into exposure. None of these changes alone would have been decisive, but together they formed a system. The Allies were no longer reacting to submarine attacks. They were anticipating them, predicting them, and increasingly preventing them. By early 1943, the Atlantic was becoming a hostile environment for U-boats, not because of one new weapon, but because the entire ocean was being watched. The hunters were still at sea, but for the first time, they were being seen. By early 1943, the Allies were no longer content to simply defend convoys. A fundamental shift in thinking was underway. Instead of waiting for U-boats to strike and reacting afterward, Allied commanders decided to hunt submarines proactively. This idea gave birth to the hunter-killer group. Unlike traditional escort forces tied to convoys, hunter-killer groups operated independently. Their mission was simple: find U-boats and destroy them. They patrolled known submarine transit routes, suspected patrol lines, and areas revealed by intelligence intercepts. The ocean itself became the battlefield, not the convoy. At the center of these groups were small escort carriers. Slow and lightly armored, they were never meant to face enemy fleets. But they carried the one thing U-boats feared most: aircraft. Fighters and patrol planes launched from these carriers could search hundreds of square miles of ocean, forcing submarines to dive repeatedly and draining their batteries. Once a U-boat was detected, surface escorts moved in. Destroyers and corvettes coordinated attacks using sonar and radar, maintaining contact while aircraft prevented the submarine from escaping to the surface. The goal was not a single decisive strike, but relentless pressure. Dive, track, attack, repeat. For submarine crews, this was a nightmare scenario. The old tactics of slipping away after an attack no longer worked. U-boats were forced to remain submerged for long periods, moving slowly on battery power while hunted from above and below. Every hour underwater brought exhaustion, fear, and the risk of mechanical failure. Hunter-killer groups benefited from coordination on a scale the Germans could not match. Intelligence, air reconnaissance, radar contacts, and sonar tracking were combined into a single operational picture. Submarines were no longer isolated encounters. They were targets within a system designed to find and eliminate them. The psychological effect was profound. U-boat commanders reported feeling constantly pursued, even when no enemy ships were visible. The ocean no longer felt empty or safe. It felt watched. For the Allies, the results were immediate. Submarine losses began to rise. Encounters increasingly ended with damaged or destroyed U-boats rather than escaped attackers. Patrols that once promised success now carried growing risk. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground for submarines. It was becoming a killing field. The transformation of the Atlantic was not driven by strategy alone. It was enforced by new weapons, designed specifically to remove the submarine's last advantage: escape. For most of the war, depth charges had been the primary anti-submarine weapon. They were simple and brutal, but deeply flawed. Charges were dropped behind an attacking ship, forcing escorts to pass directly over the target. Sonar contact was lost at the most critical moment. Explosions churned the water, masking sound and giving submarines precious minutes to slip away. That weakness would no longer be tolerated. The answer was the Hedgehog. Instead of depth charges, Hedgehog launchers fired dozens of small contact-fused bombs forward of the ship in a wide pattern. They detonated only if they struck the submarine's hull. No explosion meant a miss, but a hit was unmistakable, violent, immediate, and often fatal. For the first time, escorts could attack while maintaining continuous sonar contact. No blind moments, no guessing. A submarine was tracked, attacked, and attacked again until it was destroyed. New weapons followed quickly. The Squid mortar delivered heavier charges with improved accuracy. Depth charge patterns were refined. Aircraft carried improved anti-submarine bombs and rockets. Magnetic detonators and better fusing reduced the chances of failure. Technology turned the sea itself against the U-boats. Radar forced submarines to dive earlier and more often. Sonar tracked them deeper and longer. Aircraft denied them the surface. Weapons punished them for staying submerged. For U-boat crews, every choice became deadly. Stay on the surface and radar-guided aircraft attack without warning. Dive and sonar-equipped escorts closed in. Attempt to evade and batteries drained faster than they could be recharged. Compressed air ran low. Engines overheated. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Submarines were no longer hunters choosing when to fight. They were prey reacting to pressure. Reports from German patrols grew darker. Commanders described relentless pursuit lasting hours or days. Escorts that refused to give up contact. Aircraft that appeared whenever a boat surfaced. Crews exhausted, systems failing, options narrowing. The Atlantic had become an environment where survival itself was uncertain. By the spring of 1943, U-boat commanders were no longer asking how many ships they could sink. They were asking whether they would make it home at all. May 1943 became the month when the illusion finally collapsed. For years, the Battle of the Atlantic had been measured in tonnage sunk, ships destroyed, convoys shattered. But in May, the mathematics of the war changed completely, and they changed against the U-boats. In just 31 days, German submarines suffered losses unlike anything seen before. 41 U-boats were destroyed in May alone. Nearly one-third of all submarines deployed to the Atlantic that month never returned. Entire crews vanished beneath the ocean without survivors, without distress signals, without time to understand what had happened. The sinkings were not isolated incidents. They came in clusters. Patrol lines were detected and dismantled. Hunter-killer groups tracked submarines for days, wearing them down until escape was impossible. Aircraft attacks forced boats underwater. Escorts closed in. Hedgehog salvos struck with deadly precision. For the first time, U-boat losses exceeded anything German shipyards could replace. Construction continued, but new submarines could not compensate for the speed at which experienced crews were being erased. Training pipelines collapsed under the strain. New commanders were sent to sea with minimal preparation, facing an enemy that had mastered the hunt. Meanwhile, Allied shipping losses fell sharply. Convoys still suffered damage, but the catastrophic losses of previous years were gone. The balance had reversed. Each patrol now carried a growing statistical certainty of destruction. German command reports grew increasingly grim. Patrols that once promised success now returned empty, if they returned at all. Submarines reported being detected shortly after leaving port. Others were attacked before reaching their patrol areas. The Atlantic had become saturated with sensors, aircraft, and escorts. Morale deteriorated rapidly. Crews spoke of constant fear, of never-ending pursuit, of an ocean that no longer offered concealment. Veterans recognized the change immediately. This was not the war they had trained for. By mid-May, Admiral Karl Dönitz could no longer deny the reality. The U-boat arm was being destroyed faster than it could fight. Continuing operations at this rate meant annihilation. May 1943 was not a setback. It was a breaking point. The month when the hunters realized the numbers were no longer on their side. The collapse of the U-boat war was not only measured in steel and numbers, it was measured in fear. By the spring of 1943, the psychological balance beneath the Atlantic had shifted as dramatically as the tactical one. German submariners, once the confident hunters of the sea, began to experience something entirely new. The feeling of being relentlessly pursued. Patrol reports changed in tone. Earlier accounts spoke of successful attacks and daring escapes. Now they described exhaustion, constant tension, and a sense of inevitability. Crews reported being detected repeatedly, sometimes within hours of leaving port. Others described being hunted for days, forced to remain submerged while escorts circled overhead, refusing to break contact. Life aboard a submerged U-boat was already brutal. Heat rose quickly. Air became foul. Carbon dioxide levels increased. Batteries drained with every maneuver. Under sustained pursuit, conditions became unbearable. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Equipment failed. Small mistakes multiplied under pressure. What made the situation worse was uncertainty. Crews no longer knew how they were being found. Radar could see them at night. Aircraft appeared without warning. Sonar contacts were maintained longer than ever before. Some commanders believed the Allies could see through the ocean itself. This fear spread quickly through the U-boat arm. Radio intercepts and post-war accounts revealed growing hesitation among commanders. Requests for permission to abandon patrol areas increased. Some captains avoided radio transmissions entirely, afraid that even a brief signal might betray their position. Veteran submariners understood the truth before anyone else. The Atlantic was no longer neutral territory. It had become hostile. The ocean that once provided concealment now amplified danger. New crews suffered the most. Hastily trained replacements were sent to sea with little experience, facing an enemy that had perfected anti-submarine warfare. Survival no longer depended on skill alone. It depended on luck, and luck was running out. Morale collapsed not because of cowardice, but because reality became impossible to ignore. Too many boats were not returning. Too many patrols ended in silence. The numbers from May 1943 were not just statistics. They were names, faces, entire crews erased. By late May, the U-boat arm was psychologically broken. Men still sailed. Orders were still obeyed. But the belief in victory, the belief that skill and courage could overcome the enemy, was gone. The submariners knew the truth. The Atlantic had turned against them. By the end of May 1943, the truth could no longer be concealed. Reports arriving at German naval headquarters painted a picture that no amount of optimism could erase. Boats were being destroyed at a rate that defied precedent. Entire patrols vanished without a single survivor. Commanders who returned spoke not of opportunity, but of constant detection, relentless pursuit, and weapons they could not evade. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat war, understood what this meant. For years he had accepted losses as the price of pressure. Submarines were expendable as long as the tonnage sunk exceeded the tonnage built. But now the equation had reversed. In May alone, dozens of U-boats were lost. Experienced crews, the most valuable resource of the submarine arm, were gone forever. Shipyards could build hulls, but they could not replace years of combat experience. Each lost boat meant months of training erased in minutes. Dönitz faced an impossible choice: continue operations and risk the destruction of the entire U-boat force, or withdraw and concede control of the Atlantic. At the end of May, the decision was made. German submarines were ordered to abandon the North Atlantic convoy routes. Patrol lines were broken up. Boats were redirected to distant areas or recalled to port. The aggressive campaign that had defined the Battle of the Atlantic for nearly 4 years was effectively over. The order was not announced as a defeat. It was framed as a temporary measure, a pause to allow the introduction of new weapons and tactics, new submarines, new countermeasures, a future return to the offensive. But the men at sea understood the reality. Withdrawal meant survival, not victory. For the first time since the war began, Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with a sense of security. Losses did not stop, but they fell to manageable levels. The lifeline between North America and Britain, once fragile and uncertain, was now firmly in Allied hands. For Germany, the consequences were irreversible. Without control of the Atlantic, there could be no strategic defense against Allied power. No way to prevent the buildup of men, machines, fuel, and ammunition in Britain. Dönitz had saved what remained of his submarine force, but the war he had built it to fight was already lost. The Black May of 1943 marked more than the defeat of the U-boat arm. It marked the end of an entire way of fighting at sea. For nearly 4 years, German submarines had been the invisible weapon of the Reich. Operating unseen beneath the Atlantic, they had threatened Britain's survival and forced the Allies to fight a desperate defensive war. Victory or defeat in Europe depended on the ocean, and for a time, the ocean belonged to the U-boats. That era ended in May 1943. With the withdrawal of German submarines from the North Atlantic, the strategic balance of the war shifted permanently. The Allies now controlled the sea lanes that connected North America to Britain. Ships carrying food, fuel, troops, and vehicles crossed the ocean in growing numbers, no longer shadowed by constant fear of annihilation. The consequences were immense. Factories in the United States could now feed the war without interruption. Millions of soldiers could be transported safely. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition flowed into Britain at a pace Germany could no longer influence. The buildup that would make the invasion of Europe possible was no longer threatened. Without victory at sea, Germany's remaining options vanished. There could be no defense against Allied air power, no way to prevent strategic bombing, no means to stop the massive concentration of forces that would eventually land in Normandy. The U-boat fleet continued to exist. New submarines were built, new technologies were tested, but the initiative was gone. Submarine warfare became a struggle for survival, not dominance. The Atlantic was no longer a dark hunting ground. It was a monitored, controlled battle space, watched by radar, patrolled by aircraft, and swept by escorts armed with weapons designed for one purpose: destruction. Black May proved a brutal truth of modern warfare. Skill, courage, and experience could not overcome a fully integrated system of technology, intelligence, and industrial power. The submarine, once the ultimate stealth weapon, had been exposed. When Allied troops landed in Europe in June 1944, they did so because the Atlantic had already been won a year earlier. The war beneath the waves ended before the war on the beaches began, and the silent killers of the Atlantic passed into history, not defeated by a single battle, but erased by a system that no longer allowed them to remain unseen.